It was a cold Friday evening in December. The kind of cold that makes you pull your jacket tighter and walk a little faster. Outside, the streets were covered with fresh snow, and people were rushing to get home or find somewhere warm. But inside one of the fanciest restaurants in downtown Chicago, everything was completely different. The air was warm and comfortable. Soft music played in the background, and the smell of expensive food filled every corner of the room. This restaurant was called the Golden Note. It was not the kind of place where regular people came to eat. No. This was where rich businessmen brought their clients, where couples celebrated anniversaries with $1,000 dinners, where every table had fresh flowers, white tablecloths, and candles that flickered gently in the dim light. The owner of this restaurant was a man named Mr. Vincent. He was a tall man in his early 50s with silver hair and a serious face. He had built this place from nothing, and he was proud of every single detail. The way the waiters walked, the way the napkins were folded, even the way the glasses were placed on the tables. Everything had to be perfect, because in a place like this, image was everything. On this particular evening, the restaurant was almost full. About 40 guests sat at different tables, talking in low voices, laughing softly, enjoying their wine and their expensive meals. A young couple sat near the large window, holding hands across the table. A group of businessmen in dark suits discussed some important deal in the far corner. An older woman with diamond earrings sipped champagne while her husband read something on his phone. Everything was going smoothly. The night was calm and peaceful. The staff moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses and taking orders. Mr. Vincent stood near the bar, watching his restaurant with a small smile on his face. He was proud of what he had built over the years. Then the front door opened. A cold wind rushed in, and with it came a woman. She stepped inside slowly, almost carefully, as if she was not sure whether she was allowed to be there. And the moment people saw her, they knew something was wrong. She did not belong here. She was old, maybe in her late 60s. Her hair was gray and messy, like she had not brushed it in many days. Her face was tired, with deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She wore a long coat that had once been nice, but was now faded and torn in places. Her shoes were old and worn out, and they made a soft sound on the shiny marble floor. She carried nothing with her. No purse, no bag, just herself and whatever was left of her dignity. The hostess at the front desk was a young woman with perfect makeup and a polite smile. But when she saw this old woman walk in, her smile slowly disappeared. She looked confused at first, then uncomfortable, then a little bit annoyed. She walked toward the old woman quickly, blocking her path before she could go any further. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a voice that was polite but cold underneath. "Can I help you?" The old woman stopped walking. She looked at the young hostess with calm, steady eyes. There was no anger in her face, no shame, just a quiet kind of dignity that somehow did not match her worn-out appearance. "I was hoping," she said slowly, her voice soft but clear, "that I could get something to eat tonight." The hostess looked the old woman up and down, taking in the worn coat, the messy gray hair, the tired face. Then, she forced a small, tight smile. "I am very sorry, ma'am, but this restaurant requires a reservation, and I am afraid we are fully booked for tonight." It was a lie. There were at least 3 empty tables near the back of the room, but the hostess did not care about that. She just wanted this woman gone. Quickly. Before the other guests noticed. Before she made anyone uncomfortable. But the old woman did not move. She did not turn around and walk away. "I understand," she said softly. "I do not have any money. I have not eaten in 2 days. But I noticed something when I walked past this restaurant earlier today." She turned her head slowly, looking toward the far corner. There, under a soft golden spotlight, stood a beautiful grand piano. It was black and shiny, polished so well that it reflected the light like a mirror. It looked like it had never been touched. Just decoration. Something to make the place look elegant. "That piano," the old woman said quietly. "Is anyone using it tonight?" The hostess frowned. "No, it is just for show. We do not have a pianist." The old woman nodded slowly. Then she looked directly into the hostess's eyes and said something that made everyone at the nearby tables stop eating and turn their heads. "May I play that piano for a meal?" The hostess did not know how to respond. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. A few guests at the nearest tables whispered to each other behind their hands. One man in an expensive suit laughed quietly and shook his head with amusement. "I am sorry," the hostess finally said, her voice louder now and more firm. "That is not possible. I am going to have to ask you to leave." But before she could say anything else, a tall figure appeared beside them. It was Mr. Vincent. He had been watching this scene from across the room. He had seen the old woman walk in through the front door. He had seen the hostess try to send her away. Now he walked over with slow, steady steps, his hands folded behind his back. "What is going on here?" he asked in a calm voice. The hostess turned to him quickly. "Sir, this woman wants to play our piano in exchange for food. I told her we cannot allow that here." Marking. Mr. Vincent did not respond right away. He turned and looked at the old woman carefully. He studied her face, her clothes, her old shoes. Everything about her screamed poverty. Everything said she did not belong in a place like this. But there was something in her eyes, something he could not explain. A quiet strength, a pride that had nothing to do with money or nice clothes. It was the look of someone who had seen many things in life. "You want to play the piano?" "Yes," she replied simply. "Just one song. If you do not think I am worth a plate of food after that, I will leave quietly. No trouble. No complaints. You have my word." Mr. Vincent was silent for a moment. Around him, guests were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked annoyed that their dinner was being disturbed. Some looked amused. A woman in a red dress whispered to her husband. But Mr. Vincent did not call security. Instead, he did something nobody expected. He stepped back and gestured toward the piano. "One song," he said firmly. "That is all you get." The old woman looked at him. Something flickered in her tired eyes. Gratitude. Maybe. Or something deeper. Then she nodded slowly and began walking toward the piano. The room was still noisy. People continued talking, eating, drinking. A few curious guests watched her walk across the room, but most ignored her completely. They expected nothing special. To them, she was just a poor old woman about to embarrass herself in front of everyone. One man at a nearby table chuckled and said to his wife, "Well, this should be entertaining." His wife smiled and replied, "I give her 30 seconds before she gives up and walks away." The old woman reached the piano. She stood in front of it for a long moment, just looking at the keys. Then, slowly, she sat down on the polished wooden bench. She placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes. The restaurant continued its noise. Glasses clinked. Forks scraped against plates. Nobody was really paying attention to her anymore. Nobody knew what was about to happen next. She sat there in complete silence for what felt like a very long time. Some guests glanced at her and rolled their eyes. One waiter whispered to another, "This is going to be a disaster." The hostess stood near the front desk with her arms crossed, ready to escort the woman out the moment she failed. But the old woman did not seem to notice any of them. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in her own world. Her eyes remained closed, and her breathing was slow and steady. Then, very gently, she lifted her worn hands. Her fingers were thin and wrinkled. They looked fragile. She placed them softly on the piano keys. And in that moment, just before the first note, a feeling that something important was about to happen. The old woman took one last deep breath, and then she began to play. The first note floated through the air like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost impossible to hear over the noise of the restaurant. But then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly, something in the room began to change. The music was not loud. It did not demand attention, but somehow, it found its way into every corner of the room. It slipped between conversations. It floated over the clinking glasses and the scraping forks. And one by one, people began to notice. A woman near the window stopped talking mid-sentence. Her husband looked at her with confusion, then turned his head toward the piano. A businessman put down his wine glass and frowned, trying to understand what he was hearing. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, listen to that." The old woman played with her eyes closed. Her fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over smooth stones. There was no hesitation, no mistakes. Every note was exactly where it was supposed to be. The music was gentle at first, like a soft breeze on a summer evening. But then it began to grow. It became deeper, richer, more powerful. She was playing a piece by Chopin, one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces ever written for piano. It was called Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Professional pianists spent years trying to master this piece. Some never could. It required not just skill, but soul. It required a lifetime of understanding music and feeling every single note deep inside your heart. And this old woman in her torn coat and worn shoes was playing it perfectly. The restaurant fell silent, completely silent. For the first time that evening, there was no talking, no laughter, no sound of forks against plates. Just the music, just the piano, just the old woman and the story she was telling through her fingers. Mr. Vincent stood frozen near the bar. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were wide. In all his years of running this restaurant, he had never heard anything like this. He had hired musicians before, good ones, expensive ones, but none of them had ever made him feel this way. None of them had ever made the whole room stop breathing. The hostess who had tried to send the old woman away was now standing completely still. Her arms had dropped to her sides. Her professional smile was gone. In its place was something else, something that looked almost like shame. The music continued to build. It rose and fell like waves on the ocean. Sometimes it was soft and sad, like someone crying alone in an empty room. Sometimes it was powerful and strong, like a storm breaking through the clouds. The old woman's hands danced across the keys, and every person in that restaurant was pulled into her world. A woman in a blue dress felt tears forming in her eyes. She did not know why. She had never been a very emotional person, but something about this music reached inside her and touched a place she had forgotten existed. She thought about her mother, who had passed away 3 years ago. She thought about all the things she never got to say, and she let the tears fall down her cheeks without wiping them away. At another table, an old man sat with his wife of 42 years. They had come to this restaurant to celebrate their anniversary, but now they had forgotten about the expensive food in front of them. The old man reached across the table and took his wife's hand. She looked at him with surprise, because he was not the kind of man who showed his feelings in public. But tonight was different. Tonight, the music had opened something inside him. The businessman who had laughed earlier was no longer laughing. He sat perfectly still, his expensive suit suddenly feeling very unimportant. He thought about his daughter, who he had not spoken to in almost 2 years. They had fought about something stupid, something he could not even remember now, and he had let his pride keep him away. Sitting there, listening to this music, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would call her. Tomorrow, he would say he was sorry. The music reached its peak. The old woman's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The notes filled the room like 1,000 voices singing together. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. It was the kind of music that makes you believe in something bigger than yourself. And then, slowly, it began to fade. The storm passed. The waves calmed. The music became soft again, like a lullaby for a sleeping child. The old woman played the final notes with her eyes still closed, her face peaceful and calm. And when the last note finally disappeared into silence, she lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently back on her lap. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. The silence was so complete that you could hear the candles flickering on the tables. Then someone started clapping. It was the little girl who had tugged at her mother's sleeve. She was maybe 6 or 7 years old, with curly brown hair and big, curious eyes. She did not understand why the adults were all sitting so still. She just knew that the music had been beautiful, and that beautiful things deserved applause. Her small hands came together again and again, the sound echoing through the silent restaurant. And then her mother joined in, and then her father, and then the couple by the window, and then the businessman in the expensive suit. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was applauding. People rose from their seats. Some of them were crying. Some of them were smiling. Some of them were doing both at the same time. The sound of clapping hands filled the room, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling. "Brava!" someone shouted from across the room. Others joined in. "Brava! Brava!" The old woman opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a long dream. She looked around the room at all the people standing and clapping. For a moment, she seemed confused, like she had forgotten where she was, like she had been somewhere else entirely while she was playing. Then a small smile appeared on her tired face. It was not a big smile, not a proud smile, just a gentle, grateful smile. The smile of someone who had not been seen or heard in a very long time. Mr. Vincent walked toward the piano. His steps were slow, and his face showed a mixture of emotions that was hard to read. When he reached the old woman, he stopped and looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant grew quiet again. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see what the owner would do next. Mr. Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He closed it again. He was a man who always knew what to say. He ran a successful business. He talked to important people every single day. But right now, standing in front of this old woman in her worn coat, he could not find the right words. Finally, he simply asked, "Who are you?" The old woman looked up at him with those calm, steady eyes. The same eyes that had met his gaze when she first walked in. But now, there was something different in them. A deep sadness. A heavy weight that she had been carrying for a very long time. "I am nobody special," she said quietly. "Not anymore." "That is not true, mister," Vincent replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my entire life. Please, tell me, who are you? Where did you learn to play like that?" The restaurant was completely silent now. Every single person was leaning forward in their seat, desperate to hear her answer. The young hostess who had tried to send her away, the businessman who had laughed at her, the old couple celebrating their anniversary, the little girl with the curly hair. Everyone was waiting. The old woman took a deep breath. She looked down at her hands. Those thin, wrinkled hands that had just created something so incredibly beautiful. "It is a long story," she said softly. "We have time," Mr. Vincent replied gently. "Please, tell us." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up, and her eyes seemed to travel far away, to a different time and a different place. A place filled with bright lights and concert halls and standing ovations. "My name is Eleanor," she finally began. "And once, a very long time ago, I used to play piano for kings and presidents." A gasp rippled through the restaurant, and the old woman began to tell her story. Eleanor looked around the restaurant at all the faces watching her. These strangers who had ignored her just minutes ago were now hanging on her every word. She took a slow breath and began to speak. "I was born in a small town in Pennsylvania," she said. "My family did not have much money. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned houses for rich families. We lived in a tiny apartment with thin walls and a leaky roof. But we had one thing that made our home special. An old piano that my grandmother had left behind when she passed away." She paused, and a faraway look came into her eyes. "I was 4 years old when I first touched those keys. My mother said I did not bang on them like other children do. I pressed them gently, one at a time, like I was trying to have a conversation with the instrument. She knew right then that music was going to be my whole life." The restaurant remained perfectly silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Everyone was listening. "My parents could not afford lessons," Eleanor continued. "So I taught myself. I would sit at that old piano for hours every day, figuring out how to make sounds that matched what I heard in my head. By the time I was 8, I could play songs that I heard on the radio after listening to them just once. By the time I was 12, I was already playing pieces by Mozart and Beethoven." A woman at a nearby table shook her head in amazement. She whispered to her husband, "Self-taught. Can you believe that? When I was 15, something happened that changed my life forever," Eleanor said. "A famous music teacher from New York was visiting our town. Someone told him about me. The girl who played piano like she had been doing it for 100 years. He came to our little apartment to hear me play." She smiled at the memory. "I was so nervous that my hands were shaking. But the moment I touched the keys, everything else disappeared. I played for almost an hour. When I finished, the teacher had tears in his eyes. He told my parents that I had a gift, a rare gift, and he offered to take me to New York to study at one of the best music schools in the country, for free. Your parents must have been so proud," Mr. Vincent said softly. Eleanor nodded slowly. "They were proud, but they were also scared. I was their only child. New York was so far away, but they knew this was my chance. My one chance to have a different life. So they let me go." She looked down at her hands again. "The next 10 years were like a beautiful dream. I studied with the greatest teachers. I practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. And slowly, people started to notice me. I played my first professional concert when I was 21. The reviews said I was a rising star. By the time I was 25, I was performing with the most famous orchestras in the world." The businessman who had laughed at her earlier leaned forward in his seat. His face was serious now. There was no trace of amusement left. "I played at Carnegie Hall," Eleanor said. 3 times. I played in London, Paris, Vienna, Tokyo. I played for presidents and prime ministers. I even played for the Queen of England once. They called me one of the greatest pianists of my generation." Gasps and whispers spread through the restaurant. People looked at each other with wide eyes. This homeless woman in the torn coat had played for the Queen of England. "Then I met a man," Eleanor continued, and her voice became softer. "His name was Robert. He was a doctor, a kind, gentle man, who loved music almost as much as I did. He came to one of my concerts in Boston. And afterwards, he waited for 3 hours just to tell me that my playing had changed his life." She smiled, but there was deep sadness in that smile. "We got married a year later. I kept performing, and he kept saving lives at his hospital. We were happy. So incredibly happy. We bought a small house with a garden. I had a beautiful grand piano in the living room. Every morning, I would play while Robert drank his coffee and listened. Those were the best years of my entire life." The old couple celebrating their anniversary held each other's hands tighter. They understood what it meant to find that kind of love. "We tried to have children," Eleanor said quietly. "But it never happened for us. The doctors said there was nothing they could do." It broke my heart for a long time. But Robert always told me that we had each other, and that was enough. And it was. It really was enough. She paused for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was heavier. Then Robert got sick. The room seemed to grow colder. Everyone knew what was coming next. It started slowly. He would forget small things. Where he put his keys. What day of the week it was. We thought it was just stress from work. But it got worse. Much worse. The doctors told us it was a disease that affects the brain. There was no cure. Only time. And time was running out. A woman in the back of the restaurant wiped her eyes with a napkin. She was not the only one crying. I stopped performing. Eleanor said. I could not leave him alone. For 5 years, I took care of him. I watched the man I loved slowly fade away. He forgot how to drive. He forgot how to cook. He forgot the names of his closest friends. But you know what he never forgot? Ha! She looked up with tears in her eyes. He never forgot me, and he never forgot the music. Even in his worst days, when he could not remember his own name, I would play the piano, and he would smile. He would close his eyes and smile. The music was the only thing that still reached him. Mr. Vincent felt a lump forming in his throat. He was not a man who cried easily. But this story was breaking something inside him. Robert passed away 3 years ago, Eleanor said. And that is when everything fell apart. The medical bills had taken everything. Every penny I had ever saved. I had to sell the house. I had to sell my beautiful piano. The grand piano that Robert used to listen to every single morning. I sold it just to pay off the debts. She shook her head slowly. After that, I had nothing left. No home. No money. No family. My parents had passed away years ago. I had no children. I was completely alone in this world. I tried to find work, but who wants to hire a 65-year-old woman with no experience except playing piano? I stayed in shelters when I could. When I could not find space, I slept in parks or under bridges. The hostess who had tried to send Eleanor away was now crying openly. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay quiet. For 2 years, I have been living on the streets, Eleanor said. Most days, I do not eat. Most nights, I do not sleep. People walk past me like I am invisible, like I do not exist. I used to play for kings and presidents. Now I am nobody. Just an old woman that everyone ignores. She looked around the restaurant one more time. Tonight, I walked past this restaurant and saw the piano through the window. And something inside me ached so badly. I missed it so much. I missed the feeling of the keys under my fingers. I missed making music. So I came inside and asked if I could play. I did not expect anyone to say yes. But this gentleman gave me a chance. She looked at Mr. Vincent with grateful eyes. And for those few minutes, while I was playing, I was not hungry anymore. I was not cold. I was not invisible. I was myself again. I was Eleanor, the girl from Pennsylvania who fell in love with an old piano, the woman who played for presidents and queens, the wife who played for her husband every single morning. Until the very end. She smiled through her tears. So thank you. Thank you for letting me be myself again. Even if it was just for one song. The restaurant was completely silent. Not a single person moved or spoke. Many were crying quietly. Some had their heads bowed. The weight of her story hung in the air like something you could almost reach out and touch. Then Mr. Vincent did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He pulled out a chair and sat down right beside Eleanor. You are not invisible, he said firmly. Not anymore. And not ever again. Mr. Vincent's words hung in the air. You are not invisible. Not anymore. And not ever again. Eleanor looked at him with surprise in her tired eyes. She had expected a plate of food, maybe a glass of water. She had not expected kindness. Not real kindness. Not the kind that comes straight from the heart. I do not understand, she said quietly. Mr. Vincent shook his head slowly. No, I am the one who does not understand. I almost let my hostess send you away tonight. I almost missed this. I almost missed you. He turned to look at the restaurant full of people. Every single face was watching them. Some were still crying, some were wiping their eyes, but all of them were changed. Something had shifted in that room tonight. Something important. I have owned this restaurant for 15 years, Mr. Vincent said loudly, so everyone could hear. I have served thousands of meals. I have hosted birthdays and anniversaries and business deals. But tonight is the first time something truly special has happened inside these walls. Tonight, this woman reminded us all of something we had forgotten. He paused and looked back at Eleanor. She reminded us that every person has a story. Every person has value. And we should never judge someone by how they look or what they have. Because you never know who is standing right in front of you. The room was silent for a moment. Then the businessman in the expensive suit stood up from his table. He walked toward Eleanor with slow steps. When he reached her, he did something unexpected. He bowed his head. I laughed at you, he said, his voice thick with shame. When you walked in, I laughed. I thought you were going to embarrass yourself. I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was so very wrong. Eleanor looked up at him with gentle eyes. There was no anger in her face. No resentment. Just understanding. It is okay, she said softly. You did not know. That is not an excuse, the businessman replied. I should not have judged you. I should have been better. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out several bills and placed them on the table beside Eleanor. It was more money than she had seen in years. Please, he said. Take this. It is not much, but I want to help. Before Eleanor could respond, another person stood up. It was the woman in the blue dress who had cried during the performance. She walked over and placed more money on the table. I want to help too, she said. Your story touched my heart. Please let us do something. Then another person stood up. And another. And another. One by one, people left their tables and walked toward Eleanor. They placed money on the table. Some gave a little, some gave a lot. But everyone gave something. The little girl with the curly hair tugged at her father's hand. Daddy, can I give her my allowance? She asked in her small voice. Her father smiled and nodded. The girl walked up to Eleanor and held out a crumpled $5 bill. This is for you, she said shyly. You play really pretty. Eleanor's eyes filled with fresh tears. She took the little girl's hand gently. Thank you, sweetheart, she whispered. This means more to me than you will ever know. One. The hostess who had tried to send Eleanor away was the last to approach. Her face was red from crying. Her perfect makeup was ruined. But she did not care anymore. I am so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I was horrible to you. I looked at your clothes and decided you did not belong here. I was cruel. Can you ever forgive me? Eleanor reached out and took the young woman's hand. There is nothing to forgive, she said gently. You were doing your job. You could not have known. Please do not carry this guilt. The hostess broke down crying. She hugged Eleanor tightly, and Eleanor hugged her back. Two strangers, connected by something deeper than words. Mr. Vincent watched all of this with a full heart. He had never seen anything like it. His restaurant had become something more than a place to eat. It had become a place where people remembered how to be human. But he knew that money alone would not solve Eleanor's problems. She needed more than charity. She needed a real chance to rebuild her life. He cleared his throat loudly. Everyone, please. May I have your attention? The room fell quiet. All eyes turned to him. What happened tonight is beautiful, he said. But I want to do more than give Eleanor money. I want to give her something better. Something lasting. He turned to face Eleanor. "I want to offer you a job." Eleanor's eyes went wide. "A job? A job?" "Yes," Mr. Vincent said firmly. "I want you to play piano here, every Friday and Saturday night. I will pay you a proper salary, and I will help you find an apartment, a real home. Not a shelter, not a park bench. A real home." The restaurant erupted in applause. People cheered and clapped. Some shouted words of encouragement. Eleanor sat in shock. She could not process what was happening. Just 2 hours ago, she had been on a cold bench, wondering if she would survive another winter. Now, people were clapping for her. A man was offering her a job. Her life was changing before her eyes. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Mr. Vincent replied with a smile. "Please." But before Eleanor could answer, something else happened. A young woman near the back stood up. She had been quiet the whole time, watching with intense eyes. She was maybe 30 years old, with short, dark hair. She walked toward Eleanor with purpose. "Excuse me," she said. "My name is Miss Chen. I work for a music production company here in Chicago. We find talented artists and help them share their music with the world." The room grew quiet again. "What I heard tonight was extraordinary, Miss," Chen continued. "I have worked in the music industry for 10 years. I have listened to hundreds of pianists, but I have never heard anyone play with that much emotion, that much soul. You have a gift the world needs to hear." She pulled out a business card. "I want to record you," she said. "I want to produce an album. I want people everywhere to hear what I heard tonight. Would you be interested?" Eleanor stared at the card like it was from another world. An album. Her music. "After all these years, I have not recorded anything in 15 years, she said softly. "Then it is time," Miss Chen replied. "The world forgot about you. But after tonight, they will not forget again." Eleanor looked around the room. She saw the businessman who had apologized, the woman in the blue dress, the little girl with her crumpled bill, the hostess crying with joy, Mr. Vincent, who had given her a chance. All of these strangers who had started the evening ignoring her. Now they were standing with her, believing in her. She thought about Robert. Her dear Robert. What would he say if he could see this? She knew exactly what he would say. He would tell her to say yes. He would tell her that her music was meant to be shared. He would tell her this was her second chance. Eleanor took a deep breath. She looked at Mr. Vincent, then at Miss Chen, then at all the hopeful faces. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger than before. "Yes, to everything." The restaurant exploded with joy. People hugged each other. Strangers celebrated together. The little girl jumped with excitement, and Eleanor sat at that piano bench, surrounded by people who had become family in one evening, finally believing that maybe the best part of her story was still waiting to be written. 6 months had passed since that cold December night. The night when a hungry old woman walked into a fancy restaurant and changed the lives of everyone inside. The night when Eleanor played for a meal and received something far greater in return. The Golden Note restaurant looked different now. There was a new sign outside the front door. It read, "Live Piano every Friday and Saturday night, featuring Eleanor." People came from all over the city just to hear her play. Some drove for hours. Some flew in from other states. The restaurant that was once known for its expensive food was now famous for something else entirely. It was famous for its music, and for the incredible woman who made that music come alive. Eleanor was no longer the same person who had walked through those doors 6 months ago. She had a small apartment now, just a few blocks from the restaurant. It was nothing fancy, just 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a window that looked out at the street. But to Eleanor, it was a palace. She had a warm bed. She had food in her refrigerator. And most importantly, she had a piano again. Mr. Vincent had helped her find a second-hand piano for her apartment. It was old and slightly out of tune, but Eleanor did not care. She spent hours every day sitting at that piano, playing the songs she had loved her whole life. Sometimes, she played classical pieces by Chopin and Beethoven. Sometimes, she played simple melodies that she made up herself. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, she played the songs that Robert used to love. She would close her eyes and imagine him sitting nearby, drinking his coffee and smiling. The album that Miss Chen had promised was almost finished. They had recorded 12 songs in a professional studio downtown. Eleanor had been nervous at first. She had not been in a recording studio in over 15 years. But the moment she sat down at the grand piano and touched the keys, all her fears melted away. The music came out of her like water from a spring. Natural, pure, beautiful. Miss Chen said the album would be released next month. She said there was already interest from radio stations and streaming platforms. She said Eleanor's story had touched people all over the country. A famous news channel had done a story about her. They called it "The Pianist Who Played for a Meal." The video had been watched millions of times online. People left comments saying how her story inspired them to be kind to strangers and to never give up hope. But Eleanor did not care much about fame. What mattered to her were the small things. The smile on Mr. Vincent's face when she walked into the restaurant. The way the hostess now greeted her with a warm hug. The little girl with curly hair who came every Saturday with her parents just to hear Eleanor play. After each performance, the little girl would give Eleanor a drawing she had made. Eleanor kept every single one in a special box at home. Tonight was a Friday, and the restaurant was full. Every table was taken. People chatted quietly, waiting for the music to begin. Eleanor sat backstage in a small room that Mr. Vincent had prepared for her. It had a comfortable chair, a mirror, and a table with fresh flowers. She looked at herself in the mirror and almost did not recognize the woman staring back. Her gray hair was clean and brushed. She wore an elegant black dress that Mr. Vincent had given her as a gift. Her face still had wrinkles, and her eyes still carried weight. But there was something different now. There was light in those eyes. There was peace. She thought about how far she had come. 1 year ago, she had been sleeping on park benches. She had been invisible, forgotten. She had believed her life was over, that she would die alone without anyone knowing. But then she saw the piano through the window. And something inside refused to give up. Some tiny spark pushed her through those doors to ask one simple question. May I play for a meal? That question changed everything. There was a knock on the door. Mr. Vincent looked inside. Are you ready? He asked with a smile. Everyone is waiting. Eleanor nodded. I am ready. She stood and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she looked back at the mirror. Thank you, Robert, she whispered. Thank you for never letting me forget who I am. Then she walked out. The moment people saw her, they applauded. Not because she had done anything yet, just because she was there. Eleanor smiled and made her way to the piano. She sat down and looked at all the faces. Some she recognized. Some were new. But all were there for the same reason. They wanted to hear her play. She placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes. The room fell silent. Then she began. The music filled the restaurant like sunlight filling a dark room. It was beautiful and sad and hopeful. It told the story of a little girl who fell in love with an old piano, a young woman who played for kings, a wife who played for her dying husband until his last breath, and an old woman who lost everything but found her way back through music and kindness. When the last note faded, the room erupted. People stood. Some cried. Others cheered. The little girl clapped as hard as she could. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at everyone. Her people, her family. She had walked in with nothing. Now she had everything that mattered. She thought about others still invisible. The ones sleeping on benches tonight. The ones wondering where their next meal would come from. She wished she could tell them all something important. Your story is not over. No matter how dark things seem, light can find you. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to see you. One chance. One moment to change everything. Eleanor smiled and spoke into the microphone. Thank you for being here, she said warmly. 6 months ago, I walked in, hungry and alone. I asked to play for a meal. You gave me so much more. You gave me my life back. So tonight, I am not performing. I am thanking you. Each note is my thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Silence. Then applause filled the room again. Eleanor turned to the piano. Before playing, she looked up at the ceiling and smiled. She knew Robert was listening, smiling, proud of her. She took a breath and began to play again. The music was soft at first. Then it grew stronger. It filled every corner of the room. People closed their eyes and let it wash over them. Some held hands. Some remembered loved ones they had lost. Some made silent promises to be kinder tomorrow. And Eleanor played on. She played for Robert, for her parents, for the little girl in Pennsylvania who touched piano keys for the first time, for everyone who had ever felt invisible. When she finished, she stood and bowed. The crowd rose to their feet. The applause was deafening, but Eleanor did not hear it. She was somewhere else, somewhere peaceful. She had come so far, from concert halls to streets, from streets to this restaurant, from invisible to seen. Her story was not over. It was just beginning.